Good morning and welcome to the second meeting in 2013 of the Finance Committee of the Scottish Parliament. And if I could just remind all those present to please switch off any mobile phones, Blackberries, tablets or other electronic devices. The first item of business this morning is to decide whether to take item 3 in private. Are members agreed to do so? Members have indicated their agreement. Our second item of business is to take evidence from Barry White and Peter Reekie of the Scottish Futures Trust. Good morning to you both. The focus of this session is to consider the Scottish Government spending on the non-profit distribution or NPD financed capital investment and maintenance expenditure. I'd like to welcome our witnesses and invite them to make a brief opening statement to committee. Gentlemen.
Thank you very much, Convener and members of the committee, for inviting us here today. Peter Reekie, who is SFT's Finance Director, and myself are absolutely delighted to be here. Just to put asset management and the NPD programme into context within SFT, they are two of SFT's programmes that we're working on. Our other major programmes include the National Housing Trust, which is building affordable homes throughout Scotland, the HUB programme, which is procuring community facilities across Scotland, and the Schools for the Future programme as well. We're also working in a number of other areas, including waste and low carbon. As we've submitted a paper to the committee in advance of the meeting, I don't intend to say very much in terms of introducing the two topics. The NPD programme, currently sitting with £1 billion in procurement and rising to £1.5 billion by the end of the financial year, includes 50 projects across 30 procuring authorities. SFT have a lead role in the programme, using expertise in financing, using a simplified standard contract, and actually one of our key roles would be to appoint the Public Interest Director, which will vastly improve the transparency in these type of arrangements compared to previous arrangements. We've highlighted in our report the good progress made in Inverness College, 53 weeks procurement time, and we're seeing other procurements advance rapidly as well. In asset management, we highlighted the three strands of asset management: the central estate, looking at offices mainly; the local estate, looking at collaborative working between different public bodies; and in surplus property, looking to improve and build on and taking a lead role in disposing of very significant assets within the public estate. And that will happen over the forthcoming years as surplus property becomes available on the back of investment programmes that are ongoing at the moment. So that's by way of introduction, and thank you very much for inviting us to be here today.
Thank you very much, and also thank you very much for the detailed paper that was presented to committee members also. In time-honoured fashion, the committee, I'll open with some questions, then I'll open matters out to members of the committee. I think the first question is probably the most obvious question, which is about whether or not there is a level of over-optimism in terms of the projected capital investment for NPD. If we look at the years, the 3-year period, from 2012-13 to 2014-15, the finance capital investment is actually £482 million lower than had been anticipated when the spending review was published, and indeed in the current financial year it was 20 million as opposed to a projected 353 million. So I just wonder if you can enlighten us really as to why that is the case.
Well, in some ways, the paper we submitted addresses that point, and it was yes, but
to Jim, I mean, we've all got the paper in front of us, but obviously for the wider public who don't have the papers in front of us, and for the record, it's important often to ask questions in which, on occasion, we do know the answers. Particularly given that this matter was obviously covered in the debate on the 20th of December, but we do obviously want to hear from yourself.
Absolutely, but in some ways, I'm apologising if I repeat anything that's in the paper, yes, but nevertheless. I think there's a number of important points to make. It was always understood that the NPD financing is different in nature to capital, and therefore it follows the project progress. So if you take something like the Aberdeen Western Peripheral Route as an example, which went through a lengthy legal process, in capital, if a project is held up in a legal process, the capital funding can be switched to other projects and still spent. but the NPD financing is allocated to that project and isn't interchangeable in the way that capital is. So it's different in nature, and I think that's an important point to make. The second point I'd make is that it was always understood, and it was highlighted in the budget document, that the profile of NPD would depend on project progress. Now, the examples we've given include things like the Royal Hospital for the Sick Children in Edinburgh, and when it switched from capital to NPD, there were two things had to happen. One was the change in funding allowed the neurosciences facility to be included in one building with the Children's Hospital. So NHS Lothian rightly had to look and say, now that this funding is allowing us to do these two buildings together, is that better clinically? And they came to the conclusion that clinically it would be better to have the two buildings as one. And I think that's a good thing. But at the same time, there were very lengthy discussions with the existing PFI contractor on the Little France site in Edinburgh to get the land deal done that allows the project to go ahead. So I think in terms of progress, it is absolutely right that projects spend time and preparation to make sure that when they enter procurement, they are then ready to move forward properly prepared. So and what's now emerging from that is that procurement is moving quickly, and we've given some information that shows that historic procurement in these complex type of procurements has taken 35 months to go from advertisement in the European Union Journal to reaching financial close. We're working on timescales roughly half that in Scotland. So the preparation leads to greater acceleration at the moment.
Surely you accept, though, that there was a level of over-optimism. I mean, if you think about £353 million projected and £20 million delivered, I mean, that's clearly a substantial difference. And although we see from the figures that there is a kind of element of catch-up in 2014-15, there is an overall kind of lag, and clearly that has a significant impact, does it not?
It certainly has changed, but it's changed for good reasons, and some of those reasons I've outlined. I think one of the other big changes that has impacted on that was the switch of Borders Rail to the regulated asset base. So there was a close to £300 million project that moved out of the NPD programme and moved across to the regulated asset base. And that actually has a very big impact on those numbers. And that project is still happening. It's just no longer included in those figures. Yes,
because that was a question I was going to ask you. And in fact, you've put it on the very front, in actual fact, in page 1 of your report. Yes. Actually, that issue. I think that's something which I was keen to ask you about, the actual extent of that kind of funding. Now, we took evidence, as you'll be aware, from Jim and Margaret Cuthbert actually some months ago in terms of public procurement, and they have concerns regarding openness in terms of Scottish Futures Trust. What actually they have said is, and I quote, territorial agreements are set up in the first place and the individual projects move on thereafter. It'd be great to get our hands on those and find out where they are, in fact, performing as well as the SFT say they are. In other words, there's an issue about openness in the SFT. How would you respond to those concerns?
Well, the committee papers included that quote from Margaret Cuthbert, and I went back and reread the Jimmy Reid Foundation report that she was addressing the committee about, and those comments aren't in the report. They were verbal comments, or I couldn't find them anyway, but they were, so therefore they're verbal comments to the committee rather than in the main body of the report. In the report they did, there were a number of things that the Cuthberts quote that I actually disagreed with, and I wrote to the Jimmy Reid Foundation after they issued the report to say, actually, there are things that I believe are either inaccurate or wrong in what's said in the report. And for instance, one of the things in the report was the Cuthberts put forward that firms like Morrison Construction, in their eyes, don't count as being Scottish, even though they have a very large Scottish workforce, but because they are now part of a large UK-wide group, they don't count as being a Scottish firm. So any contracts awarded to Morrison Construction, in their eyes, don't count as going to a Scottish firm. Now, that's one area I disagree with, because Morrison Construction employ a huge number of people in Scotland, were founded in Scotland in 1948, and actually their shareholders, some of their biggest shareholders, are Scottish pension funds. But on the transparency point, again, I would disagree with the comments Margaret made. In the NPD programme, over 2/3 of the projects are standalone projects and are not subject to the territorial agreements that she mentioned. So by the territorial agreements, I'm assuming she's referring to Hub. 2/3 of the projects are out with of Hub, so on that point, she's incorrect. On the second point of whether projects in Hub or out of Hub are more or less transparent, the transparency that the procuring authorities have to adhere to in both cases are the same. So there's no difference whether they're in the territorial agreements or not. And I would actually go further, and I'll maybe ask Peter to comment on this, is that in NPD contracts, we've moved from a presumption of confidentiality to a presumption of publication. Now, that's actually a very different tenor being used in the contract. And Peter, maybe you could just say a few words about the changes we've actually made.
Yeah. I mean, the new NPD standard form of contract, which is a standard document that's owned by our team in the Scottish Futures Trust and has been developed by us, contains specific drafting. It's, I mean, if you wish to look it up, it's clause 61.1 that gives an ability for the public authority to publish the contract, including the contract, the monthly payment and performance reports, and indeed the financial model that is that's caused, I know, a certain amount of controversy in the past. So there is a right built into the contract, rather than having a whole schedule that was called confidential information. There is now that right to publish at points in time. The NPD structure also has a public interest director, as Barry referred to earlier on, sitting on the board of the company that's established to deliver the contract. And all of the 5 hub territories that are the hub model that has been mentioned have public sector representation on their boards, specifically to deliver greater openness and transparency of the action of those delivery companies. So I think in all of those concrete steps, we have increased the level of transparency in this sort of contract from what we've seen before. And I very much hope that does allow people to analyse these contracts in greater detail in the future.
Thank you. In section 3.1 of your report, remodelling and rationalising central office space, you talk about enabling new ways of working, share existing space, improving space utilisation, exit leases, and to dispose of freehold property. And you say the outcome should be a significant reduction of at least 25% in the office footprint. And there's much detail in terms of this, but over what kind of time period are we talking about here?
The 25% reduction is scheduled to take place over a 5-year time period, so between 2012 and 2017. There are initial moves happening already. One of the examples we would give is the NHS, National Services Scotland, have in Glasgow gone from having, I think, something like 5 offices into 1, and they've occupied space in a government office that had some spare capacity. So there are already moves taking place. The efficiency of that space is due to increase further over the forthcoming years. They're at 10.4 square metres per person at the moment, and they're due to go down to under 10 as more people move into that office. And as part of that, what people are doing is they do this, they're also then putting in some hot desking to allow other NHS colleagues to work in there as well. So it's about different working as well as and increasing flexibility. One of the first things we've done since being appointed to run the programme in May 2012 is to say there's a lot of activity happening, and it's happening in a good way, but actually what we want to develop is a wider strategy for each of the major locations. So to look at Edinburgh and to look at all the central government office space in Edinburgh as a whole, so that over the 5 years we move on to strategic footing, so that rationalisation can happen in a coordinated fashion, or greater coordinated fashion than currently is the case. And that will actually allow greater efficiency to emerge as that happens. Likewise in Glasgow, to look at Glasgow as a whole and say what is the best footprint of offices for the central government public sector, and that's the agencies, non-departmental public bodies, as well as the civil service. And what that will mean in practice is people sharing office space that's perhaps occupied by one government body at the moment, we will see 2 government bodies in there, or perhaps even 3, and a greater use of the space. And some of the things we've highlighted, one of the things we're doing with Fife and Edinburgh Council at the moment is piloting some use of technology that can allow one council worker to work in another council, a council office. And as technology advances, that ability to share space and to use space more effectively will increase.
Thank you. And over this 5-year period, what kind of sums are we talking about in terms of the rationalisation and again in asset disposal? What kind of savings are we talking about?
Well, in the central estate, the estimated savings is about £28 million per annum, which will be a recurring, ongoing basis once that rationalisation is in place. And in the local estate, the estimate is that £500 million, which is partly from asset disposal, but also from operating efficiencies as well, will be the aggregate saving over the 5-year period, or saving or benefit, because some of it will come from asset disposal as well.
I'm now going to open up the session to colleagues on the committee, and the first person to ask questions will be Jamie, to be followed by Gavin.
Thank you very much, Convener, and I was interested to see the comment in your paper. The NPD programme is, in relative terms, one of Europe's biggest programmes of additional investment over and above capital budgets. Can you put that in some context for us? Can you quantify that? How does it compare with what's happening elsewhere in Europe?
Well, the only country to have done something of a similar size, and these are based on figures from an EIB-sponsored, European Investment Bank-sponsored body, is France, that had something like a €30 billion investment programme. Now, France is obviously a considerably bigger country than Scotland, but in relative terms, France has probably done slightly more or thereabouts, but it's one of the biggest. Behind that, then, the Netherlands, so we're on par or ahead of the Netherlands, slightly behind France in proportion, but actually it is, compared to other European countries, we are, for the population of Scotland, investing considerably more through the NPD programme in addition to capital budgets than elsewhere.
That information is available. Could we see that information?
I can certainly share the information from the EIB-sponsored body. Yes,
I think that would be useful. I also see currently there are projects in the NPD programme. Currently there are projects totaling more than £1 billion in procurement, and this is planned to increase to over £1.5 billion by the end of this financial year. Can you set out what accounts for the £500 million difference?
I might ask Peter, there's a number of projects, and I think since we published the paper that Ayrshire and Aaron's project has moved into procurement. That's one that in the past week has moved forward into procurement. But the big differences will come from a number of schools projects entering procurement, a number of health projects, and most significantly the Aberdeen Western Peripheral Route, which will enter procurement as well. So it's across all sectors, but one of the biggest differences will be the AWPR moving ahead. Is anything, Peter?
Oh, okay. And you touched on this. I was going to ask for if you could quantify this, but you already have. But I still think it'd be useful to know how you've achieved this in terms of you spoke how you've got a far improved procurement time. I think you said that the standard used to be about 35 months, and it's now half that. Can you say how you've achieved that?
I think there's a number of ways, and I think getting the project preparation right is one of the areas, but I might ask Peter maybe to answer that question because he's the one most actively working with the projects.
I think the context is that in its report in the autumn statement in December, Treasury was saying that PFI projects in England are still, they use the word stubbornly taking 35 months to go through procurement. Our programme, as Barry referred to, has seen the Inverness College project take 53 weeks to reach preferred bidder, so just about a year. And the new target for that in future in England will be to reach that stage in 18 months as an aspiration. We've done a number of things that allow us to move through that procurement stage more quickly. The first of those is to do more design work up front, in, as Barry's referred to, proper project preparation. And that does two things. First of all, it allows us to move through that procurement stage more quickly. And the other thing it does critically for the industry is something they've been asking for, which is to make it cheaper to tender for these sort of projects, because we're seeing less time spent with 3 competitive design teams doing the same thing at the same time. And that is saving money overall for projects, which will get fed back to the public sector as people have to recover their bid costs somehow. And that more efficient interaction of the design process with the procurement process is one very big step. A second thing that we've done is to very significantly simplify the contract. So I've referred to the standard contract that we publish on our website. That is there and is being written pragmatically, so it is capable of acceptance by anyone reasonable in the industry. We don't need to spend a lot of time with lawyers toing and froing on points of detail in that contract. We have changed some of the detail of the risk allocation in there that had previously asked private sector companies to take risks that they were simply not able to control. And if you ask someone to take a risk they're not able to control, they will either try and negotiate and wriggle out of it and take time during procurement, or they will simply price the worst case scenario and we'll end up paying for it. So examples of insurance risk and the potential for changes in law sometime in the future, we've now changed the allocation of those risks in the contract. So we've changed the design process, we've changed the detail of risk allocation, and the final thing that we've done is we have simplified the range of services in the contract that are included. So you might have previously seen contracts of this nature with cleaning and catering type services included. Those have typically taken a long time to specify, they've taken a long time to procure and negotiate, and they've also, frankly, sometimes reduced the level of flexibility in the contract in the future to allow the public sector, when it needs to change things, to make changes in the contract. We've taken out that wide range of services, and we only now include the very core maintenance services required to keep the asset in a good condition. And that also has simplified the procurement process. So design process, contract simplification, and reducing the scope of services have all allowed us, working with really good teams in the public sector procurement authorities, to reduce that timescale.
And in this condensed process with the simplified contract that you speak of, are you still confident that the process and the contract, particularly, it's still rigorous enough, it's still tight enough that we're going to see efficiency and a good deal for the public purse?
Absolutely.
That's fine, convenient.
Gavin, to be followed by Jean.
Thanks. I want to come back to some of the NPD questions that the convener started his questioning off on. As he mentioned, at the time of the spending review in September 2011, the estimate for construction spend under NPD for 12-13, so the financial year we're currently in, it was 353 million, but we were told by the Cabinet Secretary that the actual spend would be 20 million for this financial year. What projects are the 20 million pounds being spent on this financial year?
I think it's mainly, the Aberdeen Health Village is the...
Yeah, the Aberdeen Health Village, and there'll be some early works on the Inverness College, which is due to close before the end of the financial year.
If we stick just with this current financial year, that obviously leaves a difference of £333 million. Now, you've given some explanation clearly in your written submission, but in terms of the breakdown, for that gap of £333 million for the current financial year we're in, how does that break down amongst, firstly, the Borders rail link that you mentioned, but other projects that are clearly not going to be happening on the ground in this financial year? How is that £333 million broken down?
Just to, in looking at the profile for the NPD programme, at the outset, we're doing that, and we put this in our report as well, at a stage where all the projects are at pre-outlined business case. So they are, and when Audit Scotland, for instance, look at adherence to programmes, they talk about two key stages in a project life. One is the initial approval, which is outlined business case, and then the full business case, which is sort of the subsequent approval. And that's when actually project dates are judged to become more certain. So when we're looking at the NPD programme profile, it's looking across all the projects. So saying some schools will happen or some hub projects will happen rather than necessarily specific ones. But the biggest impact on the numbers, Gavin, you're asking about is the shift of Borders Rail and the Children's Hospital, for instance, being delayed by PFI, or sort of some very big projects that had a big impact on those numbers.
What was the, with that in mind then, what was the rough amount that, when the spending review happened in 2011, what was the rough amount that you thought would be spent on the Borders Rail in the current financial year, 12-13?
I don't have those numbers on me.
I don't have that figure to
Yes.
hand, so.
Again, it comes back to looking at the programme as a whole, and the Borders Rail, M8, AWPR were all transport projects that could have moved forward at different speeds, including the AWPR being held up in legal process, as we know. So the numbers are across the programme rather than across individual projects.
So, I mean, the 353 million, though, is you'd admit, is quite a specific figure to have put out there as what we think is going to happen within a financial year. Do you have if you don't have it today, that's fine, but do you have somewhere a rough estimate breakdown of what you anticipated that was going to be spent on project by project over the course of that financial year?
We do have a high level overview of what that could have been, yes.
Is that something you can provide to the committee?
Yes, it is.
Okay. My next question, I guess, was going to be based on the financial year going forward, 13-14, which obviously we vote on next month. Again, at the time of the spending review, the projection was for £686 million would happen in that financial year. When the Cabinet Secretary gave evidence to us in November, he said it would be £338 million. Is that £338 million still the correct figure, or has there been any change since the 5th of November, I think it was?
There's been no change to that figure.
Okay.
But I'd always say, in forecasting figures in a programme involving 50 projects and 30 procuring authorities, and each of the projects going forward still has to get planning permission, for instance. In some of the college projects, for instance, we're working on now, we may hold a funding competition to make sure that we secure absolutely the best value for the taxpayer. So some of the project timetables can hinge on external factors, statutory decision making. So there's always, as project and people working in projects know this, there still is some key risks in project timetables going forward.
If I take from that, I mean, the 330 million figure is the most up to date, best estimate that you've got.
Yes, it is.
Okay. Are you saying from your previous answer that actually it could be less than 338 million, or are you saying it could be more than 338 million?
I would say it could move as a figure for the reasons I've given. Mm-hmm. So, for instance, the figure for this year, which is 20 million, if Inverness College reaches financial close just before the year end, that figure could go up. If it reaches after the year end, so if Inverness College reaches financial close this year, there could be some balancing effect between next year and this year, if you see what I mean. Yeah. So figures could move across the boundaries of the years.
Okay, but your But on the 338, though, are you hopeful that that's going to go up? Or are you saying there are risks it could be less than 338? I'm just...
I think it's unlikely to go up because, if certain of the key projects that we're looking to move forward were held up, and I've given some of the reasons why that could be the case, then it could be less.
Okay. Just in terms of, you explained the Borders Rail as being one of the reasons for the change. The Sick Kids Hospital was another one you specifically referred to, and I've heard you mention that before. The Aberdeen Western peripheral route you also mentioned. I'm just trying to establish how much expenditure on that was expected over the current financial year and next financial year. I mean, the reason I ask is because at the time of the spending review, as you'll know, RoadSense announced it was going to appeal the Court of Session decision. So this was a live legal case at the time. How much expenditure was projected at the time of the spending review on the AWPR for 12-13 and 13-14? Or was it projected for 14-15 or later anyway because of the legal case?
I think it was projected more for 13-14 and onwards from that. But there's a whole range of projects. You take something like Dumfries and Galloway Royal Infirmary, where as a result of the shift to NPD, the NHS board re-evaluated what they were going to do in the site, and they've moved from a refurbishment of the existing hospital to a new build in the outskirts of the town. Now that actually, it's a good example of a project that could have moved quicker had they stuck to the original plan, but by taking stock and saying what's actually best clinically and moving ahead on a new plan that clinically the NHS board believes a better solution. But what that has meant is that project had to go through site acquisition and look at, site identification first of all, and then site acquisition, and then looking at actually how the hospital can be built on that site. Now, that's what I referred to in my paper as actually getting the right thing, which is very sort of loose terminology, but actually when you're making these big strategic investment decisions, I think it is right that projects prepare themselves that way to say, if we're going to spend substantial money on this hospital, let's make sure it is the right thing in the right place. And that good preparation, I believe, will lead to better value for the taxpayer in the long term.
Just briefly, if I may, come here, go back to the Aberdeen Western peripheral route, though. At the time of the spending review, which your initial projections were based on, given that there was a legal case ongoing, how much of the expenditure did you think was going to take place, or how much did you project was going to take place in 13-14, the next financial year?
I don't have that number to hand. Again, across all the transport projects, have you taken across them all? But that's something I could supply to you if that would be helpful.
Sure, I mean, if you don't have time.
You don't
Yes.
have, but if it's something you're willing and able to supply, then I'd be very grateful. And if I could, you've agreed to supply the top level list, I think, for 12-13. Is it possible to get the same list for 13-14?
Yes, it is.
Okay, thank you. I'll leave it there. Thanks, Kabir.
Jean, to be followed by Malcolm.
Thanks, Convener. I wanted to ask you about the procurement process and just maybe going back as an example, the introduction of PFI being seen as competitive tendering being the best way to get value for the public pound. In Highland, we put together and invited bids to build 7 schools. And in fact, there was only one bidder, largely because the project was so big. And I'm sure all members have been lobbied by small businesses and so on who feel that they can't actually enter the bidding process. And I wonder if how that is changing with the, I mean, you referred to the new simplified contract, but evidence seems to be from other European countries that they can actually break these contracts down much more in order that smaller businesses do have a chance of winning some of that business. Again, the Cuthberts in their report say that they're supporting the idea of radically changing the culture of procuring agencies so that it's the norm to split contracts into relatively small blocks unless there are overriding reasons for not doing so. It seems to me even the question over Morrison's and whether it's a Scottish company or not, given that Scotland is largely made up of small businesses, would this not be a solution to lots of things? And what update is there on that move? I mean, I'm sure you've been approached yourselves by small builders, by architects, by a lot of small businesses asking that there should be a change in the process.
Probably helpful. I might ask Peter to come in specifically on what we're doing in community benefits in the NPD programme, but just to talk at a high level, some of the projects we're working on are large, and you know, things like the M8 or the AWPR that Transport Scotland are procuring are large projects, and they're large because it makes sense to do them that way. A lot of the other projects we're doing and working on across the board are smaller, and SMEs are playing an active role in a lot of those projects. Now, it wasn't funded through the NPD programme, but Drumbray, which is one of the first hub projects, 80% of the value of work that project went to SMEs, and is something we are watching very closely, is both the value of work and the location of contracts going to SMEs. So it is a very, very important part of what we look at within Scottish Futures Trust. And I think, Peter, it would be helpful maybe if you just give some examples from Inverness College or sort of wider in the programme what we're doing on the community benefit side.
I think there's a couple of points specifically on the SME sort of side. As Barry said, if you're building a big building, then that's a big contract, and I think that we are working a specific subset of general government procurement, which is at the larger end, and we certainly wouldn't see it as a good idea to separate out elements of a building and buy those separately. What we do think is a good idea is to make sure that all of the specialist subcontractors in an area that are often SMEs have the opportunity to bid for packages of work within that larger contract. So we're very clear that the larger contractors who coordinate all of that work should be very open with the local marketplace and help them to bid for the packages of work that are appropriate for them. So our contract, Inverness College, for example, the preferred bidder has just been announced as Miller, and they have run already and will run more events for local contractors to meet the buyer, to meet them, so that they are fully aware of all of the packages of work that are coming and can tee themselves up to bid for that work. In the hub programme as well, as Barry mentioned, we have a high proportion of SMEs getting packages of work, so the boots on the ground are to a large extent employed by small SME companies, a lot of them Scottish based, that deliver the work. Now, on the other side of community benefits as well, we see it as very important that there is a good deal of training and local job opportunities coming out of these packages. A lot of those also will be delivered by SMEs, but we follow Construction Skills Scotland guidance on the amount of training opportunities that should come out of these larger projects in particular. And again, to use Inverness as an example, they will be running training programmes on that site that allow the work placement elements of the college's own courses to be delivered on the building site for their new project. There's sort of neat symmetry in there. And the first apprentices on that project, the first apprentice is likely to be employed before we even reach the contract during the preferred bidder stage. So both in access to the SME marketplace and in providing local training and employment opportunities. We think that the way we're procuring these projects and the way we're contracting and holding people to account for what they're delivering is going to deliver some very strong outcomes for local communities.
So can you just be specific about what has changed then? And if we were to look to the new simplified contract on the website, what would reassure me as an expert plasterer or something that I can take part in this project? I mean, what have you changed before that we could reassure the Cuthberts, for example, in their criticism of...
I think one of the things I would stress is in the NPD programme, it's actually partly about culture as well as what's in the contract, because working with the procuring authorities and each of the NPD projects, we're asking each of the procuring authorities to appoint a community benefits champion, because quite apart from what's written in the contract, there's a culture to be created that means that community benefits are actually in the DNA of the project rather than simply in the contract terms. The community benefits clause we put in the contract is the strongest clause we can put in line with the existing laws and regulations that allow us to write these things in. But I think the bigger thing, the bigger change is actually in the culture, which is incredibly important. Also in the hub programme, where some of the health centres and schools that are being funded through the NPD programme will be delivered, there's a longer term relationship that allows apprenticeships to go across several contracts rather than simply across one contract. So where contracts are smaller, the opportunity to have continuity of employment is even greater, which is actually quite a significant change.
And just two further points then. One will be, will there be a report on the finished project and how it worked out in terms of what you wanted to see happen and changing that culture so that you have the evidence to see how much of the value of the contract went to local contractors in the area? And secondly, I guess you must be aware of how it works in Europe, and have we got lessons to learn from there where things don't appear to, quite big projects haven't appeared on the European bidding process so that other European countries would bid for that work, because, as I understand it, these contracts are broken down into sizable pieces that smaller businesses can apply to do. So the two things, just the outcome of I absolutely appreciate what you're saying, that you want to change that culture. How will we know if that's worked? And secondly, how have they managed to work it in Europe when we haven't? Yes,
I think, first of all, we do look to Europe to say, is there anything we can learn? So I think that's one of the things we do. And if you take the Netherlands as an example, for the type of projects we're working on, there's probably only a handful of contractors in the Netherlands that will bid for those contracts. Within Scotland, our market is much more fragmented, so therefore when we advertise a contract, there may well be 10 people capable of doing it, or even 15. So the nature of the construction markets between Europe, take the Netherlands as an example, and between Scotland, they are very different in nature. And I have worked for European contractors, one of whom, BAM, dominated or is one of the biggest players in the Netherlands, and Skanska, who's one of the biggest players in Sweden. And you tend to have in European markets, in France, for instance, there's 3 or 4 major firms dominate the construction market in France. It's just a different market by its very nature compared to that in Scotland. So what we're doing is saying, by all means, yes, we can learn lessons, but given the topography we work in, what's the best we can do within that topography?
Followed by John.
Okay, well, some of what I wanted to ask has been covered. So, I mean, I'll start just by summarising, really, what I take to be a summary of what you said in response to Gavin Brown's detailed questions. You seem to be suggesting, because obviously it was the headline issue that Kenny Gibson started with, that the main, a lot of the explanation of the underspend, as it were, is specific projects such as the Royal Sick Children's Hospital. But I mean, would you say in general terms that the time it takes to to procure on the NPD model, is it actually, you're saying it's quicker than what they're now talking about PFIs in England, is it also quicker than the most recent PPPs in Scotland, say 2 or 3 years ago? Are you saying it's a faster process, or are there in fact intrinsic reasons in it that make it more difficult to come to a quick conclusion of all the different stages for MPD?
I think there's two very separate issues. There's getting projects ready to go into procurement, and if you take as a broad example some of the phase 1 and 2 schools that were announced quite some time ago, and there's one in Edinburgh that had to buy a site, and again, as a phase 1 or 2 school, that has meant in preparation it has taken time to buy that site, to do the consultation on where the school was to be located as part of that whole purchase arrangement. And again, I think the outcome of that is actually a really good outcome. So the project preparation, and I actually am a passionate believer in project preparation, and I believe it gets better value for the taxpayer in the long run, is the bit that we've largely been engaged in to date. The procurement, all that we're seeing at the moment is that it is moving faster than the average that the Chancellor quoted, the stubborn average of 35 months, and it is faster than historic PPP-style procurement in Scotland. That's what the current evidence shows, and we believe that the simplification we've carried out of the contract form, Peter highlighted some of the examples earlier about taking some of the services out, changing the risk profile, running the procurement in a different way, making sure the procurement teams are properly resourced, is actually all feeding into that faster procurement.
So that would suggest that you're not really having any difficulty putting financial packages together. Obviously, some people, to begin with, were thinking that it's not going to be so attractive in terms of private finance, but from what you're saying, it is attractive. But could you kind of remind us about the financial returns for people who invest in NPD? I know it's called non-profit distributing, but that's just a headline, as it were. If you could remind us of that, and then just give a general comment on how attractive or otherwise it is proving to be in terms of private finance.
Yes, well, the NPD, as I've said before, if you ask anybody in the private sector, would they prefer a fixed capped return or an unbridled return, the answer you'll always get from people in the private sector is they would prefer an unbridled return. What we are seeing is the capped return people are bidding to be a lower capped return than the old starting rate that was uncapped in historic projects. So we are very confident that there's value being secured in that. But I think within the NPD programme we've captured greater value than that. I think the changes we've made to make the services fewer have increased flexibility in the contract. I think some of the contractual changes Peter talked about earlier that change the risk allocation, improve value for money as well. But I might just ask Peter to comment on the general financing, because one of the key things we are looking at is to attract senior debt or pension fund money into projects as part of what we're doing. And we are living in challenging times for banks, as we all know. And therefore, what Peter and the team are doing is looking to make sure that we have projects that are financeable in the current market, and that will mean different solutions for different projects. Peter, perhaps just want to say a few words about that.
Yeah, I mean, the financing of these projects overall comes mainly in two parts. There is a big chunk of senior debt, which is the most secure form of debt in them, and that's usually 80 to 90% of the financing requirements. And then a smaller, riskier tranche of financing on top, which is where people in the past have made uncapped returns. And that is the element that is now capped through MPD. And as Barry said, we've managed to reduce the level of return in that. The big chunk of the financing, which has always been a fixed rate from banks in the past, that market has changed very substantially since the global financial crisis. And I think if I was to sit here saying that market was unchanged since 2007, you'd be very surprised indeed. And we have seen a lot of different structures coming to bear. And one of the things that my team does in the Scottish Futures Trust is act as a centre of expertise for this really quite tricky financing of major projects, which isn't done very often. For some of the early deals, for example, for the Aberdeen Health Village, that was the senior debt was provided by Aviva. Many of you will know that as the Norwich Union, so a life insurance company. And they are very interested in that long-term, secure financing because it reflects liabilities that they have over the long term for life insurance. And bringing players like that into the market that sort of at a technical level, we see them pricing off government gilts rather than off this LIBOR rate, the interbank rate that you've probably heard about recently. And that pricing from gilts and their keenness on this gives us a very competitive rate for the overall financing of the senior debt elements, even in these difficult financial times. And we're also going to attract European Investment Bank funding into our larger projects in Scotland. So the Glasgow College, which is going to be coming up to financing quite shortly now, will see the EIB lending at a very competitive rate for half of that senior debt. And we will run a competition, as Barry referred to earlier on, for the commercial banks and see who can bring the best deal, whether it be life insurers, whether it be banks, whether it be pension funds to put in the rest of the money. And for the bigger projects, again, for the roads projects, again, we anticipate European Investment Bank involvement in those projects, and that could be through a structure that the President Barroso in the European Union is very strongly backing, called the EIB Project Bond, and that would see the EIB reducing the risk of the senior debt by offering to put money in if and when it's needed if something goes wrong, and that would allow us to fund large chunks of the big projects through the bond markets, and we would very much expect to see the pension funds buying those bonds, strongly rated bonds, around about an A- credit rating, and we're doing the work with Transport Scotland to work through that credit rating process to deliver the best financing package. And just as an example, it's some of the preparation work that Barry's talked about on the M8, for example, doing some of the utilities works up front and outside of the contract. That might seem like a broadly sensible thing to do. You might worry about the risk of the interface. But what it also does is it hits a very specific button on the rating agency's process for how they rate the security of that project. So we know that by doing that utilities work outside of the contract, we're increasing the credit rating of the debt in the contract and delivering better value for money for the overall financing package. So all of these things and the contract and the financing are interlinked to get the best value for the financing of contracts overall.
Okay, thanks very much.
So, Mal, this is one of the questions you should have included in that is it attractive to people generally? Actually, we are attracting, large numbers of bidders to projects, and we are getting competitive bids coming in. And I do think the NPD programme is seen by the industry as something that's going to give a substantial boost over the next 4 to 5 years. So I do think from that point of view, it is proving. So the basis of your question was, is it sufficiently attractive to people to get them to compete? The answer is yes, it is.
Now, you gave some good news about the presumption of publication of contracts. Obviously, there has been some criticism, I know, in relation to the South Children's Hospital that FOIs have produced largely redacted documents. I mean, is that something that will still happen at this stage of the process, or are you saying the whole issue is being opened up more generally to freedom of information requests?
Yeah, there are, on NHS Lothian's website, where the business case for the Six Children's Hospital is published, there are redactions in it which are viewed to be sensitive because of the procurement that's ongoing, and I think commercially that is the right thing to do, given that we want to make sure we get the best deal for the taxpayer. And so from that point of view, limited redactions, I think at this stage, are the right thing. Our focus very much working with NHS Lothian is saying, how do we get the best deal for the taxpayer for that hospital? And what we want to make sure is we drive the procurement through hard and fast and start to get the hospital built at a competitive price with a good financing package. So limited redaction at the moment we think is the right thing.
Okay. I mean, Jean Urquhart asked you a lot, so I won't repeat all that about procurement and SMEs and local employment. But I mean, if I can just ask you one question on that, which to some extent you've covered, but it's really the points, I suppose, that the Cuthberts made in their report. And I suppose one of the things that we're saying there is the way in which contracts are made very large, and obviously you're deliberately doing that in terms of the hubs, bundling them presumably because that makes it more attractive and presumably is better value for money as well. But does that have a negative consequences in terms of, you know, our interests in SMEs and local employment? And of course, a supplementary point on the hub bundling, which you may want to answer, is the Cuthbert's allegation that in fact that's, in their opinion, contrary to European rules in terms of the long-term arrangements that you're coming to with the hub bundling and a particular provider for that.
I would like to, I think, just tackle the SME point head on, because there is limited bundling in hub, and the bundling only happens, an example of there's 3 health centres in the north of Scotland.
And in Edinburgh, I think.
Yes. Now, they're being bundled because they're being financed through the NPD programme, and to attract a funder, you need sufficient projects put together. So by bundling them, it allows them to happen now using that additionality that NPD brings. So in Tane or in Aberdeen, these health centres or forests, when they open, they will be opened because they were bundled and procured together. Generally, we're not bundling. So there are health centres through Hub, not part of the NPD programme, that are being built at the moment. And in one case, and this is just an example of the sort of thing that's happening in Hub, which is a real change of behaviour, a major contractor has agreed to mentor an SME to help them provide the right level of service to the public sector in developing these a number of health centres. So we're getting the appropriately sized SME working with them, because one of the things we're trying to achieve in Hub is 0 defects when projects are handed over, and this is one of the great challenges there is in construction, is to get buildings finished to a high standard. And by that mentoring process, a major contractor is showing a change of behaviour. It's getting an SME involved in a project and actually helping improve the SME skills so they can take a bigger role in the future. Now, I think that change in behaviour is a remarkable shift. And as I said earlier, a huge amount of work's flowing through to SMEs from main contractors in Hub as well. And the NPD programme, in creating additional work, is having a huge impact on flow down of work to SMEs. And very recently, we've been working with an SME in Clackmannanshire, the National Housing Trust, and again, we've had to work very much in partnership with them to help them get to a point where they can develop a National Housing Trust proposal and deliver that for us to build houses in Clackmannanshire. So I think the SME voice is well heard, and rightly so, and I think bundling is being used appropriately to make sure projects can go ahead, but actually where projects are funded through capital, they tend to proceed as isolated single projects rather than being bundled to allow the financing to work for
Okay,
DBFM.
thank you. I mean, I think the North Edinburgh Health Centre is also in a bundling arrangement as far as I understand.
Yes, but I'm saying it is probably one of the ones financed.
You mean it's been delivered through Hub?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, last question. Maintenance, we've not asked you quite so much about, but you did make the interesting point about 28 million estimated savings from the central estate and 500 million from the local. I mean, I wondered, if that's over a specific period of time, in other words, do you have kind of targets that you have to achieve in terms of savings on an annual kind of basis, or is that just something that eventually at some unspecified date is the savings that will be accrued?
There's 2 different approaches. In the central office estate, we took the view that it was going to take a number of years to implement the changes, and therefore the £28 million saving is estimated to be in place from 2017 onwards. and it will take a number of years to work through. Now, there'll be some incremental shifts during that time, but it will depend on leases and lease exits and all sorts of other things. So therefore, there is a time span to that. The 500 million is something that is on an ongoing basis. So it's during the 5-year period, the 500 million of disposals and other things will emerge. So it is more easily updated as we go through that process, and we will be issuing periodic updates on that. And it will include things like disposals or collaborative working to manage operational PPP projects, another example, or it will include things like local authorities, as they are already doing, looking for ways to, we're looking at 3 pilots at the moment to work with local authorities to try new ways of working to pilot that, so that as they develop a strategy to rationalise their office estate, that new way of working can be built into that. So, but that will be incremental over the 5 years, whereas the £28 million is at the end of the 5-year period.
Okay, thanks very much.
Thank you. Deputy Convener, to followed by Michael.
Thanks, Convener. I mean, we started an hour ago with were you over-optimistic in some of the figures that were put out, and I've listened for an hour, and I still think the answer to that is yes. Some of the figures that have been mentioned, 353 million, 686 million, are they better said as they are the maximum possible that could have been achieved, and there was no way they could go up, but there was lots of reasons why they could come down? I mean, is that, would we have been better calling them the maximum possible rather than an estimate?
Certainly, from our perspective, it's always understood the figures could change. And I think that's one of the key things. And change they have, and change for good reason. And when you're dealing with 50 projects across 30 procuring authorities, it's always a judgment as to how quickly things can progress. If taking the phase 1 and 2 schools as an example, there were a number of projects. We didn't identify specific ones and say project A, B, and C will advance quickest, saying actually we looked and said a number will advance quicker than others. As it has turned out, those projects which actually largely sat out with the local authorities' capital plans and therefore had to be pulled in and took longer to get up and running than had been anticipated. Therefore, those phase 1 and 2 projects have taken longer in preparation than originally assumed, but actually that is for good reason.
Yes, I mean, I'm accepting that point, but did anything go faster than was expected?
No.
Right. So the figures that were mentioned were the maximum possible, and they could not go up, but they could come down.
Yes, but the bit that's going faster, I think, is the procurement phase, and that's the bit that I believe is now reaping the dividend of that preparation period.
Okay, and well, on that point, faster than PFI, faster than PPP, how about compared to traditional funding from just straight borrowing?
I think there's 2 points I'd make in that. I think one is that even any project that's being procured, and a lot of the issues we've talked about, the land issue on the Royal Hospital for Sick Children, that would have had to have been resolved whether the project was funded through capital or through NPD. The difference is that when it's an NPD project, because the funding isn't interchangeable, it sits with the project, that if that had been a capital project, the funding could have been reallocated to another, perhaps smaller project, or a number of smaller projects that could have proceeded. Whereas with the NPD programme, if something hits an obstacle like the negotiations with the bank and the Royal Hospital for Sick Children, then that is the bit that holds the funding. The funding sits behind the project rather than being able to be teamed and ladled across other projects.
So an NPD project will always take longer in the whole scheme of things?
It can take longer, and certainly the funding issues and the funding competitions that Peter talked about earlier are bits that can add time to that process, yes.
Okay. You said there was good reasons, and I accept the point that if you look at it project by project, there are good reasons why things have been delayed or whatever. But, on the first page of your report, it gives some of the reasons, and I take the first one is shown to be the Borders Rail, and I accept that. I mean, 2, it says the need for necessary and thorough project preparation. Well, I mean, presumably that applies anywhere. The complex and strategic nature of many of the projects. Well, that's hardly a big shock. Of course they're complex and of course they're strategic. Land acquisition, well again, surprise, surprise, you always have to buy land. Ensuring that the asset will support service delivery models. I'm not even sure what that means, but presumably it sounds like a good thing. Enabling works, legal process, statutory consultation. I mean, none of these are exactly a big shock, are they?
Well, just to ensuring assets to support service delivery models, the example I gave of Dumfries and Galloway Royal Infirmary, the shift from refurbishing an existing site to the new site, that is also backed by a strategy in the area for how healthcare is going to be delivered over the, that's maybe I could have used plainer English, which but that's the essence of it. Yes. Or indeed the combining of the clinical neurosciences building with the sick children's building in Edinburgh. So these are areas that have to be addressed in that project preparation phase. I come back to what I said about Audit Scotland. Audit Scotland judge project progress normally after the OBC, outline business case, and final business case. In the project preparation phase, we're dealing with projects that are in the early stage of preparation, and actually there is a great deal of unpredictability in just the issues that may arise or the time it would take. And for instance, the switch of Borders Rail from one method of financing to another, these things happen, and that's what we in managing the programme are dealing with.
Okay. I mean, you've said that preparation is very important, and I completely agree with that, because I think the biggest disaster is when you start building a building and then replan it as you go along, which I believe happened here. But the other side to that is, though, that if something is delayed by 6 months or a year, people sit unemployed for 6 months or a year, and the money is effectively, if the money's there already, if the money's not there, that's it couldn't happen elsewhere. But is that something you take into account, that actually building something quicker is good for the economy, boosts jobs, that kind of thing?
Absolutely. And if the project is ill-prepared and goes into procurement, one of 2 things are likely to be the outcome. Either the procurement will take substantially longer, and that will have a negative impact, and in terms of it'll push things back further, or as you say, a project will start to be built and then have significant changes. I don't want to give the, there are examples of that, and that is actually incredibly expensive, often for the public purse. So across all our programmes, TIF, National Housing Trust and NPD, we are hungry to get projects into procurement and on site, but it's also a case of saying it doesn't do the public or private sector any good, because if you have, as I have been working in the private sector, bidding public sector projects, ill-prepared projects waste public and private sector resources, and the private sector would not thank us for allowing ill-prepared projects to proceed, because it wastes their resources as well as wastes public sector resources.
Yeah, I'll take that point. I mean, I was encouraged that you said there was going to be more flexibility. For example, I think you'd taken out the cleaning and some of that kind of maintenance work out of projects, because it struck me with PFI that there was a distinct lack of flexibility. And I mean, can you maybe expand a wee bit how far the flexibility would go? Because, I mean, if these things were traditional, a school is owned by a council and they're tight for money, well, they can maybe postpone replacing the windows because they're weighing it up against other things. It has struck me with PFI that, that the council lost that freedom because it was so built into the contract that the schools had to be replaced every 15 years, the windows had to be replaced every 15 years whether they needed it or not, kind of thing. Is there more flexibility in that area? And I mean, another one was being that, for example, we had a secondary school in Glasgow under PFI. We want to maybe add on a primary school to it or a special needs school, and that just became a nightmare because of the PFI project. Would that kind of thing be easier under NPD?
Maybe I might have Peter to field that, because he can give a more detailed response.
There are different levels of change, and I think all of them are important to think about. Some of the criticisms of the past have been on awful small things that make a big difference to the everyday operability of a building, like putting posters up in school with blue tack and putting notice boards up. And we've made some very clear simplifications and changes in the contract that will give the occupiers of the buildings more rights and ability to do those sort of things for themselves as and when it makes sense to do so. We've also been a lot clearer on the transparency of pricing of small changes in work that the contractor will rightly do for themselves at some point. But we've tied that down so that the pricing for that is all well understood and doesn't get layers of cost added to it as it goes through the system. So the smaller value changes, we've given rights to do that yourself and clear pricing when it's right that the contractor does it. So I think on that minor day-to-day flexibility, we've made a very big difference. On more significant changes, then some of the early PFI deals, and we've talked a little bit about the Edinburgh Royal Infirmary, had rights for the banks and the funders to stand in the way of any change happening, and they had a sort of absolute veto over change, and that isn't the case anymore. So we've had to deal with on the Edinburgh Royal Infirmary a group of 11 funding banks. Now, if one of those, as turned out to be the case, wasn't very keen on the change happening or wasn't very keen on doing the work that got them happy with the change even, then we've had to go in and spend a good deal of time and personal sort of effort in dealing with those funders to give us something that I agree with you we should have had the right to do ourselves, and that has now changed. When you talk about the maintenance of a building, the life cycle replacement, I think there is some very good reasons why if you build a building, you should maintain it in good condition. So when you pay for something on an annual basis, obviously you don't have those lumps and bumps of when particular things get replaced, and that overall annual payment is set on at the outset of contracts.
Okay. And I mean, I think the final area I just wanted to ask about there's the argument put in the paper that because we're spending more on capital, there's going to be a big saving on maintenance. And I accept that would be the case in some cases. However, presumably when you build roads, you actually increase the need for maintenance rather than reduce it because there's more roads. I mean, have you got solid figures on this, or will you be able to do a report in due course that shows how much maintenance has been saved?
I'm just trying to look for some the NHS in their State of the State report that was just produced. Say two things is that estate replacement and upgrade will reduce backlog by £256 million over the forthcoming years as a result of that investment programme. That is partly an NPD, and it's also things like the new South Glasgow Hospital, which sits outside of NPD. But they also talk about a reduction in backlog due to be properly disposed of. So, that's the other side as well, that there are properties at the moment that can be disposed of that have a backlog maintenance. So it's not the only way of tackling maintenance. There have to be other reasons than backlog maintenance to make such significant investments. So, the South Glasgow Hospital is producing a single bed, single room type facility, replacing some outdated facility. So it's a big shift in clinical care as well. But a side effect, if you like, is the impact on backlog maintenance.
So there might not be savings in what's actually being spent on maintenance, but at least the buildings will clearly be in better condition and the backlog will be reduced.
It is, and I think the point Peter made, and perhaps picking up on your earlier point, if you look at history, some of the decisions to not replace windows, using the example you gave, would have been good decisions if a few years later the windows had been replaced. But I think sometimes there's been a cumulative effect of delay, which has meant there are backlog issues and so on, right now. So, and actually, one of the challenges is as you've articulated, is in the current climate when money's in shorter supply, is continued to maintain, and particularly with new investment, to make sure that is maintained to the right level going forward.
Okay, thanks so much.
Okay, Michaelson.
Yeah, thanks very much, Convener. It's to get into this area of bundling, and you've given a few examples of where you think by bundling it actually helps to take the process forward. But I have to tell you, just using local examples of where I've seen bundling being the method used to take things forward, I haven't seen the process being speeded up. The M8 bundle, for example, which I have to declare a constituency interest in, is that all of it is entirely within my constituency. I have the glossy brochure, which I bring out every now and again to remind myself that this project or these three projects that were bundled together were initially around 2005-2006. The timescales were for three individual projects, one to start in 2009, which was the M8 completion, followed by the Wraith interchange, and then the M73-74 widening project. Now, as the procurer, can you tell me, was it Transport Scotland that took the decision to bundle them, or was it on your advice that they bundled them?
It's Transport Scotland's decision to bundle those projects, but our opinion would be that was the right thing to do, and I'll maybe just explain why I believe it's the right thing to do. In NPD, if they were procured as three single projects, and given the restraint or given the constraints on the capital budget, NPD is allowing this to happen now rather than wait for many years. So I think that's well, it is because the capital budget there's not sufficient capital to allow all the projects without NPD to go ahead. And
so it was the change to NPD that caused the decision to, because the M8, which was a standalone project, was envisaged to begin in 2009. So it was the decision to bundle it, which then put it with the Wraith interchange, which was envisaged to start in 2010 and was subject to public inquiry. So
the rationale why I think bundling is important is that with NPD, roads maintenance will be part of the project. So you build the stretch of road and afterwards you maintain it. And to do something like the Wraith interchange as an isolated project, the roads maintenance would be a very isolated small bit of roads maintenance. So in roads projects, if you're doing them through NPD, where it's design, build, finance and maintain, it makes sense to bundle projects because doing them in standalone packages wouldn't necessarily present good value for money for the taxpayer.
that sort of verifies what I was told by construction companies and by people in the construction industry, that when the decision to go to NPD was made, that three standalone projects weren't very attractive to private finance companies who would have financed the original standalone projects. So it was the decision to go to NPD which caused the M8 to be bundled with the M74 and Wraith interchange, to make it an attractive proposition to attract the private finance that now is going to finance the bundle. Is that right?
I would look at it the other way. I think the bundling is there to secure better value for the taxpayer. It's not to help the private sector. It's actually to help the taxpayer.
I totally appreciate that. The problem I have with it is that my constituency is identified as a logistics and distribution hub, that a lot of companies have located there over the years with the expectation that these projects, as envisaged, were going to begin in 2009, 2010 and be completed by 2014. We're in the first month of 2013, and according to you, and it's been verified by government ministers, the procurement process is now whittling it down from 4 bidders to 2. So we're now at the tendering process in January 2013 for projects that the glossy brochures were produced in 2006 to say would begin in 2009. So it's actually the decision to go to bundling which has caused the delay in the beginning of the construction of these projects, and that construction companies who have been looking for this work to come along haven't had that work. It's now just been tendered for. And if you know that area at all, for 2 hours to 3 hours every morning and 2 hours to 3 hours every afternoon, logistic companies are losing a fortune because the M8 Wraith interchange and M73-74 are more reminiscent of car parks than they are of viable transport links. So have you calculated into all of your savings that have been done and efficiencies that have been done in bundling? Have you added in the cost to the Scottish economy and the Lanarkshire economy for the loss of revenue and the added cost for distribution companies who are located in that area waiting on these roads to be built?
I think without NPD, the project wouldn't be able to happen for many years. So given the capital constraints that exist, so I would say it's actually the opposite of what you're saying. NPD is enabling that project to move ahead that would otherwise have to wait for several years for capital to be available to allow it to happen.
But I was told that the capital was available for the M8 in 2007.
Well, I can't comment on what was, you know.
It was the decision to go to NPD
Yes.
that stopped the money from being available. The M8 was then added to the M73, 74 and Wraith interchange, and it was the bundling decision that delayed the procurement to the point that we're now, in January 2013, still talking to the tenders when the projects were expected to start in 2009.
Well, without NPD, the project wouldn't be started now. That's NPD is allowing it to happen now, and that project is moving ahead now. And I think the confidence that gives people that it is happening exists because of NPD.
So it'll be completed in 2017 rather than 2013.
Well, or much later if it had to wait for capital. And that's the reality in times of declining capital.
But it wasn't declining in 2007 when this project was already in process. The public inquiries had been conducted. Transport Scotland were already talking to people in 2007 about the tendering process. It was stopped. And then after the projects were expected to start, that they were bundled together to make them a more viable prospect under NPD.
I think, the capital constraints that exist are being mitigated by the NPD programme and projects.
But those constraints didn't exist in 2007 when this M8 project was already in the pipeline.
I think the decision whether M8 was done through capital or through NPD is one that Transport Scotland ministers made. From our point of view in delivering the NPD programme, NPD supplementing the capital budget, I think economically you're right, the M8 is incredibly important, and I think doing it through the NPD programme is allowing it to happen earlier than would otherwise be the case, as is also the case with AWPR and with the other projects in the programme. And I think that over the next 4 or 5 years, as the NPD programme rolls through all its projects, is going to make a significant difference both to the construction industry but to the wider economy. And I know things like the AWPR, the commitment to start the procurement, which is due to start very shortly, that's already giving confidence to companies in and around Aberdeen that actually this project has been talked about for a very long time, and the M8 has been talked about for a very long time as well. And if you talk to people in the construction industry who bid the M8 many, many years ago, which was then a cancelled procurement, so the M8 and strategic importance has been known about for a very long time.
Yeah. Another thing that was known about, and I've got the glossy brochures for this as well, was the NHS Lanarkshire, A Picture of Health programme, where they had envisaged building 14 primary care facilities. Now, a number of them under that project have already been built. They were already in the pipeline, the outline business cases had been completed, and a decision was taken by NHS Lanarkshire to review the 14 projects and decide which ones they were going to go ahead with because the commitment was already there. But then a hiatus occurred and the timescales for all the other ones that came after that, where the outline business case hadn't already been approved, they have not been built. I'm told in recent discussions with NHS Lanarkshire that they are now part of a hub, they're a bundle, and a procurement process has started for building these outstanding projects, which were already envisaged in their 2006 Picture of Health capital investment projects. So again, things that were already in the pipeline, things that had been timescaled, where a programme of construction was expected to take place, didn't happen. A gap has been created, and we're now in a procurement process to talk about building projects under NPD, which had not been bundled together, had the financial arrangements which were in place in 2006 not been changed. Some of them would already be in work, would be being built, and people would be getting employed by that. So do you build that into your decisions when you talk about the efficiency that your NPD procurement process is creating? Because, well, when you start the NPD project, could have started 2 or 3 years ago. In fact, I think they're still only talking to the private financial institutions at the moment about this hub in Lanarkshire. So it's now that it starts, and it may well be more efficient from now until completion. But we've had 5, 6 years where projects that should have been being built have not been being built, waiting on the go-ahead to start building them under NPD.
No, I fundamentally, without NPD, the 5 or 6 years, it might be 5 or 6 more years before those projects could be built. Either those projects or other projects would have to wait, because NPD is providing additional investment. So NPD is allowing those projects to go ahead now. So if it wasn't for NPD, those projects in Lanarkshire would either have to be prioritised higher above something else in the capital programme, and something else would have to wait, or they can go ahead now.
But they
with
were already
NPD.
in NHS Lanarkshire's capital programme.
I can't comment on NHS Lanarkshire's capital programme. What they put in the programme and how budgets are allocated are not my responsibility. What is known and very clear is that those projects can only happen now because NPD is providing additionality. It is providing additional headroom over and above capital budgets. And if it wasn't for that, they wouldn't be happening at all, or other projects elsewhere wouldn't be happening
But when
at
they
all.
were in A Picture of Health in 2006, they were standard procurement projects in the capital programme. They had to be stopped, and they're now going to be built under private finance, NPD.
I really can't comment on how NHS Lanarkshire asked for funding from central government or elsewhere, but there's a lot of projects that are only happening because NPD is allowing them to happen. And I think for the construction industry and for the health service delivering those projects, that is good news, and it's a very positive
But
part.
it's not been good news for the local people who are expecting to have primary care facilities that they don't have, because they've been waiting on an NPD project to go ahead years after it was already envisaged that they should be built.
Well, the dates you're talking about predate the NPD programme being announced, so I can't comment. I can't really comment on what was happening in 2005, 2006. Factually, the schools, Inverness College, Glasgow College, the roads, the hospitals we're working on, the choice is do them now through NPD and get them done, which I think is the right thing to do, and I think NHS Lanarkshire and Lanarkshire will benefit from those projects coming through. I think the M8 being built will benefit the community as well. That is only happening because NPD is in place. Without NPD, they wouldn't happen.
I think you're missing the point, Mr. White, to be perfectly honest with you.
Thank you very much, Michael, and thanks to other colleagues for their questions. Now, the session has ran over about half an hour more than I actually anticipated, because I wanted to give colleagues as much free rein as possible in order to ask questions on this very important area. I didn't want to restrict colleagues in any way. I'm just going to finish with one question from myself, which is basically how confident, given some of the discussions that we've had around the table and some of the questions that have been asked, can the Finance Committee be in terms of the Scottish Futures Trust future financial projections, given the kind of variance of the estimated value of NPD finance capital investment over the 3-year period that we've seen?
As projects move from project preparation to procurement, they pass that initial approval, the outline business case, and that increases the certainty of timescales and project size. The other thing which we haven't touched on is that there's good news in that the PAC report that the civil service submit in terms of the capital programme, Inverness College dropped out of that report because it only deals with projects over 50 million. So the cost of some of the projects we're procuring are going down. So things like Inverness College is being procured at a lower cost than first envisaged. In terms of the figures, there is a greater degree of confidence in the figures of any project that is post outline business case, which is this initial approval stage that Audit Scotland recognise, than those in project preparation. So there is an increased certainty about the figures, but there's still caution because of some of the things we've talked about earlier as well.
Okay, thank you very much. I'd like to thank our witnesses for the very significant contribution to today, actually, quite clearly. Sorry to get a wee bit tongue-tied there. I'm sorry we weren't all here at the start of the session, Michael. I think that's probably because of some of the reasons he asked you questions on. And thank you very much. We'll be seeing you again very soon. Given that that is the public session over, I'd like to call a short 5-minute recess to allow members to have a natural break, and then we'll go into private session, also to allow the public and official report to leave. Thank you.